to Saskia Sassen, who's Professor of Sociology and Committee on Global Thought at Columbia, also works at the LSE, and she's going to talk to us about cities in a global context.
Thank you very much. It is an enormous pleasure for us, the urban age tribe, to be in Mumbai. Mumbai is of enormous complexity, a long history, much longer than New York. And I, for one, look forward to learning more than lecturing. I want to share with you some of my thoughts about global cities in general. And I also want to share some of the data that we have about Mumbai especially, but also Delhi, that comes from a huge study that looked at 65 leading cities. First, a few thoughts about cities in a global economy. I think that a key trend that is now clear, but that 20 years ago was not, is that one of the specific contributions and hence strategic roles of cities in a globalizing economy is the capacity to produce a very specific kind of knowledge capital. And we could call it urban knowledge capital, whereby the whole that this capital represents is more than the sum of all the high-level and talented and brilliant professionals and all the state-of-the-art professional knowledge firms. Something happens in the context of a complex city that makes possible this escalation, where all these creative classes produce something that they couldn't produce if they were not in the city. The question then is, why does this matter? And here a second trend that has become very clear over the last 20 years. And that has to do with the recognition. We now know that. We didn't quite know that 20 years ago. That the more globalized a firm or a market becomes, and the more it operates in electronic networks, think global finance, the more it is subject to velocities and can in fact engage in those velocities because it is partly electronic, the more those firms, those economic sectors, those markets actually need a territorial moment. And that territorial moment gets mostly distributed across a growing network of global cities. That territorial moment has to do with that urban knowledge capital. When these trends began 20 years ago, the notion was the more electronic, the more able to assume enormous velocities, the less space and place would matter. In fact, it has been the opposite. There are, in a way, two geographies to globalization. One is a geography of dispersal, of diffusion, more and more countries, more and more offshore factories, more and more call centers all over the world. And the other is a very tight geography where things get concentrated. This this concentration, if you want, of operations doesn't fall from the sky. It has to be made. It has to be built. Architects matter, engineers matter, all kinds of people. This making of this platform entails displacements of older users and older types of users. And out of that emerges a second key feature of global cities, which is a new kind of politics. A politics that has to do with the rights to the city. And there is an image that this is the image that I like to show. The politics of the rights to the city are local. They often involve contestation with a particular building owner on a particular block. But they are a new kind of global politics. Why? Because they recur in place after place. So you have, if if you want an increasingly vertically integrated global economic system that hits the ground in all these global cities, and then you have a horizontal globalization of a certain kind of politics. Each of the global cities we have visited has both features. This image I like because it suggests, I don't know if it is legible, but people, nice people and not so nice people. One is people and the other is policemen. Some policemen are also nice people, of course. But anyhow, debordering. It deborders its own space. It deborders the globe. It is a parallel, this kind of politics, to this urban knowledge capital, where the whole is more than the sum of all the knowledge workers. Now, I want to go back to this notion of two geographies. And here are some slides that capture this. This is this is looking at it through the lens of a particular firm. Now, this happens to be a very big firm. And I want to point out the two geographies. One is a geography we might think of as a geography of extraction. The mines, the oil fields, distributed all over the world. But the headquarters, that's the global city function, in this case, 4 places. Now, this slide demonstrates not only these two geographies of globalization, and if we were dealing with consumer markets, it would be even more distributed. Think of all the big consumer firms. But it also shows us that cities in this geography don't just compete with each other. This big firm, Billiton, needs several global cities. Here's another one, Rio Tinto, another big mining company. 2 cities for headquarters. And I think that that is a critical issue. Number one, that we have these 2 geographies, and global cities are, if you want, a strategic geography for command functions, for knowledge functions, etc. But the second trend is that as the global economy has expanded, you have seen an expansion of global cities. And one of the key systemic trends is that they actually form infrastructure, collective infrastructures for big global firms and for global markets. They are not simply competing. One of the things that I do in my research practice is to deconstruct the global economy into the multiple circuits that constitute it. Strictly speaking, there is no such thing as half. It's a growing number of circuits. And so the question becomes for a city like Mumbai, what are the multiple circuits on which that city is located? And there probably are 70, 80 for a city like Mumbai. In doing that, one also begins to understand what are the other cities on each of those circuits that are part of this globalized infrastructure. And my fantasy, and it is a fantasy, is that the leadership, both the political leadership, the corporate leadership, the civic leadership of these cities that are located on particular circuits, that they can start working together. I think of these specialized multiple circuits in which a city is located and the diversity of cities on each of those circuits as a kind of infrastructure for a new type of governance, global governance, but also urban governance. Now, because of this platform that is built, there is a displacement. And there is a whole series, not just of political issues, but of economic issues that come about. One quick way of putting it is that the global city is a place where inequality grows. And I want to just share some figures from Manhattan. Manhattan being the extreme zone within New York City. All cities, as far as I'm aware of, have inequality, and they have always had it. There are times, though, when that inequality grows dramatically. This is one of those times. Now, in the case of Manhattan, I'll just read quickly through some of these figures. You can see that in 1980, when this cycle of globalization is just about to take off, top 20% of earners in Manhattan, we're just talking people who actually have a job, that doesn't include everybody in Manhattan, made 21 times what the bottom fifth made. Now, Manhattan at that point ranked number 17 in terms of inequality in the country, all the counties in the United States. In 1990, the top 20% in Manhattan made 32 times what the bottom 20% made. And today, the top 20% make 52 times what the lowest 20% make. And now, Manhattan today has a proud position of being number one of all the counties in the United States in terms of inequality. I don't want to speak about Mumbai. I'm not an expert on Mumbai, on these issues, but it does seem to me that if it's happening, it's including in London, including in Paris and in Frankfurt and in Oslo and in Copenhagen, we see these trends. Not as extreme as in the United States, but the trends are there. I would have a very hard time believing that this is not happening in Mumbai. In other words, yes, globalization brings an enormous amount of dynamism to the picture of cities, to the economy of cities, but it comes with a price, and we've got to recognize that. Now, one of the trends that I find in my work on several global cities, but not Mumbai, is that what tends to shrink is the standardized economic sectors, the middle sectors, and the middle level of jobs. They don't disappear, but they tend not to be particularly sort of dynamic. They are not growing. What grows is a top 20%, an extremely rich new middle class, and a bottom of, a mix of low-wage workers and workers with jobs that now pay less than they used to pay. I think these are all very serious issues that need to be, dealt with. One component in all of this is the growth of a new kind of informal economy. In the case of the global north cities, whether that is Paris, whether that is Berlin, whether that is London or New York, this new informal economy is very visible because governments in those countries have managed to regulate all jobs and to sort of eliminate the older informal economies. This new informal economy is not somehow, an anachronism in these cities. This new informal economy is part of the advanced urban economy. Not all of it, but quite a bit of it is. In the cities of the global south, this new informal economy is submerged under the older informal economy, and hence it's much less visible. But the research that I know about in a city like Sao Paulo, for instance, suggests that you also there have this new informal economy that is part of advanced capitalism. That, I think, feeds, in a place like Manhattan, some of this lower, this growing inequality. I want to now quickly move, because I am being disciplined in terms of time here, to a series of data where Mumbai is part of the story. Now, the expertise in the room here about Mumbai is much larger than the team of people, I was part of that team, who worked on this study. The study is interesting. We looked at the 65 top sort of cities that some of them are full-fledged global cities, others are more cities with global city functions. Now, this is just, Mumbai is not on the top 20. This is just a quick framing, and what I do like is that London is number one now. This is not the only study that shows that, but as you can see, the top 20 is a whole mix of cities. I should explain that we used 100 data points, aggregated into 6 major variables, and I'm happy to put the full study on the web. I'm just going to jump on things. So, Mumbai. Investor protection. Actually very high. Out of 65 cities, Mumbai ranks 26th. Financial services network. Numbers, I should say, I'm sorry, that the numbers on the left are the rankings of the overall cities. So I just threw in 19. I didn't put all the other 18 on top and the rest. And then here, number 17. That's a very high ranking. If you look at total value in equities trading, I don't know if that is visible, this second one here, Mumbai ranks number 16. very high. Corporate tax burden, number 53. That's close to the bottom. That means a very high corporate tax. You understand that's negative from the perspective. So then my question is, where does all that money go? All that tax, that is. And then we have other low rankings for Mumbai. Quality of life. And I wish that some of that corporate tax burden would go into this. Very low, as you can see. If you see the other groups of cities. Now, maybe interesting is that Beijing is right above Mumbai. Doesn't rank very high either. Basic services. Low. Health and safety. Low. Now, I want to remind people that I started out with a few slides that showed Mumbai as a very significant global financial center and capable of collecting a lot of corporate tax. So in that contrast, I want to put this. Now, number of commodity contracts, Mumbai ranks number 6 in the world. That's very significant. Financial flow dimension, how money, the ease with which, behind each of these stands a lot of very concrete issues. The ease with which money comes in and out, you know, very high. These are very high rankings because, you know, there are powerhouses that are involved. Now, ease of doing business drops very low, number 60. Ease of starting a business, not easy, number 54. In other words, with financial issues, Mumbai is ranked in a totally different category than this other dimension. So ease of starting a business is pretty difficult, but it's even more difficult to close a business. Now, you know, there's all kinds of stuff behind this that explains it. I like this one, since you opened one of them. But it ranks very high. You can see that, right? Number of 5-star hotels. Volume of commercial real estate. We all know. Now, here what I also find interesting is the group of cities with which it is. You know, you see that some Mexico City, what is it, the one that, you know, several cities where you have a lot of real estate, but the diversity of the cities involved is also astounding. That this is something that is cutting across very diverse types of cities. And I couldn't help but get at this. The Google hits, you know, there is actually data on. And Mumbai is somewhere in the middle. And the cities that rank at the top, actually it's very, very interesting to see what other cities that catch people's imagination. But again, I thought it was interesting to see the group of cities within which Mumbai fits there. And anyway, yeah, so it's a whole sort of global perspective. Now, I want to conclude by coming back to this question of the character of these global cities today. First point, their number has grown. And I would say there was a first phase, 1980s, when the global economy is taking off, and a few cities emerged as very significant. The 90s, an explosion in the number of countries that opened up, that deregulated, and the global cities, this intermediate link between globalization and very specific national economies. I think that today we are entering a third phase, which is a kind of thin capillary network where smaller and smaller places get articulated with the global economy. In a way, we have now, through these global cities, an infrastructure for the running, the managing, the debugging, etc., of global economic operations. The other side of the global city, the politics. The dynamics of global cities produce a democratic deficit. Mind you, that's not the only thing producing a democratic deficit. There are a few other variables that work. But this is truly a puzzle in terms of how do we govern these cities so that questions of economic justice, distribution of benefits, can be assured, at least to some extent. Finally, for the city itself to have this maldistribution of income is a significant loss. It is much better for a city largest share of its income going to a middle class, a modest middle class. Because that modest middle class is far more likely to spend its money in the city rather than a top 20% of very rich people that can send their money anywhere. I don't know if people notice the signs, or I notice the signs on the buses here in Mumbai that say Indians now can invest overseas, etc., at least $200,000. No, I mean, the modest middle classes don't have $200,000 to invest overseas, but they have money that they spend in the city. So there is something very exciting about this economic era for cities, and there is something really challenging, which has to do, I think, with the political side of the matter. The economic side needs to be governed a bit more, I think, than it is right now. I thank you very much.